Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or evening or late night, wherever and whenever you find yourself today. My name is Rebecca Davis, and I'm a producer with The Companion. Our goal at The Companion is to bring you compelling stories, events, and experiences from your favorite fandoms, including Star Trek, Stargate, The X-Files. Well, the list could go on. This comes in the form of deep dive articles, podcasts, interviews, and innovative series. You can check this all out after the roundtable by going to thecompanion.app and signing up for a 30-day trial. But today we get to add to that offering with our very first roundtable, The Wisdom of George Takei. We were incredibly fortunate and honored on our new Star Trek interview series to boldly ask to sit down with the historic, comedic, idealistic, optimistic, the iconic George Takei. We knew as soon as we finished the interview that we wanted to talk about it, and we wanted to get others talking about it. 3 Star Trek commentators agreed to come on the journey with us through George Takei's experiences with homophobia and feeling forced to stay closeted, racism and ethnocentrism, Buddhism and death, his wonderful friendship with Nichelle Nichols, and even guilty pleasures. I'm honored to have them with me today. Jessie Earl is a video producer, journalist, and LGBTQ advocate. She is known for her YouTube channel, Jessie Gender, where she dissects social issues through a geek lens, but she has also written for GameSpot, The Advocate, Out Magazine, Skybound Entertainment, Microsoft, and more. Welcome, Jessie.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Really excited to have you here. Kyle Sullivan is a director in the video and film production industry, and his YouTube channel, Trekspertise, is a must for Star Trek video essays. Hello, Kyle.
Greetings. How is everybody?
Great, great. And Giraffe, or Spotted Giraffe, is a lifelong Trekkie and a diehard TOS fan since the day she saw Uhura sitting on the bridge of the Enterprise. Co-host on the Strange New Pod, Giraffe is an avid collector, cosplayer, and podcaster. Nicknamed the curator of everything Uhura, she strives to conserve the contributions of the Black fandom, its history, fan art, fanzines inspired by Nichelle Nichols, and to bring recognition to the key role they played in Star Trek at its beginning. Her motto, representation matters. And we are very glad you are representing today, Spotted Giraffe. Thank you for being here.
Bonjour. Thank you for having me. Very excited being here.
Excellent. So now that you're all here, and before we dive into some clips from the interview, I'd like to have a discussion about you and Star Trek. So why, how did Star Trek come into your lives, and what ultimately has that meant for you, your identity, and your ideals?
I guess I'll start. I'll jump in. For me, I'll make the long story short. My story tends to go with everyone from my generation. Story begins in that my dad got me into Star Trek. I got into it through an audio drama. He gave me the audiobook of Star Trek Nemesis is how I got into it, and I fell in love from there. So it's the weirdest way to get into Star Trek, but I was very, very pleased and excited to. And for me, Star Trek just informed so much of my childhood. It was a gateway into all of science fiction, as Star Trek often is for many people, and just opening up my my love of all things geeky and nerdy, but then also my love of, as you were saying, like my values of humanity and taking delight in the differences of others, as Gene Rodenberry would say. I don't think I would be who I am as a out trans advocate, an LGBTQ person, without Star Trek, because it gave me the ability to talk about myself as a trans person through characters like Jadzia Dax, but then also gave me the way to sort of just take love in infinite diversity and infinite combinations, so much so that I have it literally tattooed on my arm. So yeah, no, Star Trek for me is this franchise that just really I think informed me more than anything else in my life, because it gave me my outlook on the world, my hope for a better humanity, my love of community and caring for others, and then also just my love of being a weird nerdy dork. So yeah.
You can't leave that one out.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle, you want
to? Sure, yeah. So the 90s reruns of The Next Generation popped up on a local TV station, and they put them on at night, every night at 9. And it was right when my bedtime changed from 9 to 10. So I was young enough to start watching them and completely hooked. And, from the beginning, it was kind of obvious that Trek was like a secular Aesop's fables. And it was about their allegories about dealing with other human cultures. And so I immediately grafted onto that. And started hanging out with all the exchange students in my school, which was wonderful, and then went on to get degrees in anthropology and biology and everything. And so like it really engaged me on a science level. And even though I don't do that now, I'm in filmmaking, but like it sticks with me. It gives me like a lovely perspective that I don't find on sets often, and it's just a really nice franchise most of the time.
Most of the time. Fair enough.
And for me, growing up in France, accessing Star Trek was not really easy, but I remember stumbling on it on TV at my neighbors and being absolutely, I'm going to say, mind blown by Uhura just being gorgeous, incredible black woman with a job on a spaceship. And I've been a secret nerd for a long time because nerd culture was not really a thing in France until pretty recently, but I know it informed a lot of my choices. I'm a linguist, I speak 7 languages, and I mean, if I could go now be the communication officer on board of the Enterprise, I'm ready. Take me right now. But mostly I know that seeing the future, I realized that I could be these people's past, and it was my duty to take all the step I could for recognition, representation, for carving my spot and my place everywhere I wanted to exist. So Uhura could be in the future.
I really like that mindset of thinking that you were the one of the people in the past for this thing to be. That's a really great way of looking at it and thinking about it.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, I know we're all really eager to dive in on some George Takei wisdom. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our first clip that we have.
Racism is at the core, and we tend to be ethnocentric. Japanese Americans have gotten to the point where we see it a little bit broadly, and identify with other Asian Americans, and we work as Asian Americans. But at the core, it's racism, and an even greater continuing victimization of people by racism is the African Americans. Since 1618, when the first Africans were brought to this country as slaves, we had that racism problem. And so what we need to do is recognize that the core issue is racism, and the people that have been struggling with racism the longest, most continuously, are the African Americans, through slavery, through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement, to what we're going through now, George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, where the fact that you're Black already means the police draw their guns for maybe a expired license plate, for a minor offense. And if there's some resistance, they're shot. Racism is the problem. And so you call this to boldly ask, well, I've been campaigning with Asian Americans. We mustn't be so ethnocentric and say Asian hate. It's racism that's across the board to all people, minority people.
Right.
We need, as Americans, to recognize that the core issue is racism, and it affects people that look like me, or people that look like Latinos, or African Americans. It's all the same. The source is the same. And we've got to address that as the cure for this constant, continuing subjugation of minority people to cruelty and outrageous injustice. It is racism, period. That's America's original sin.
All right, so we're diving in pretty heavy right from the beginning. But what do you all think about this viewpoint? It's an interesting. I think we've heard him say this before. This idea of ethnocentrism, and everyone being too ethnocentric in America or even outside of America. So, what do you personally think about that?
Well, I definitely have some thoughts on that. I mean, he's 100% correct. I would add in that it started even earlier with the colonialist attitudes with Native America, the 500 some odd nations of Native America. It's a stain. But I think that like ethnocentrism isn't just an American problem. I think it's like the default human mode to pick in groups and out groups for a variety of complex reasons. And the thing that makes the United States different in the world, makes us special, is that somehow here we're trying to be anti-tribal. We're trying to kick against that instinct. And it's not always so clean because it's so easy to revert back to those us versus them, molds. And like we have a real deep, dark strain of it right through the heart of our narrative here. And it's still kicking and alive and voting. And I think he's on the money. You have to watch yourself, each and every one of us, because ethnocentrism is it's potato chips. It's easy to grab and open and eat.
It really touched me when he said that, because very often when I see on Twitter or I hear people saying, I don't understand why people do that, or maybe they're afraid. I was like, it's racism. Say it, say it, write it. It is racism. This is nothing else. And as you said, Kyle, I often do this exercise with people when when I teach. I tell a story about an interaction I had with a Uber driver. And if I tell you just a Uber driver, you will have a construct in your mind of this person, of their gender, their origin, their ethnicity. We are wired to put people in categories. That's what we do with this mindset that is important. And I moved in the US 6 years ago, and I have to say that racism is everywhere, right? I lived in different countries. Each country and each people come with their own history of interaction with other people, and racism is everywhere. Racism in America is particularly brutal. Because it is, for me, linked to a real violence that I cannot ignore. When I travel to other state and I see people showing me that they're wearing a gun, that has another effect on me than in France, where there's not that many weapons. So the fear for my life is something that I really learned in America. But I have to say that it's how Americans are always ready to discuss and always ready to bring this topic to the table and to do better and to, I don't know, to have it out in the open and say, yes, there's a racism problem that I really respect, because this is not something you see in every country. In France, for example, most people will tell you, there's no racism, everybody's French. The number of times that I heard this. So yes, it's a double-edged sword, right? It is a dangerous thing in the US, but I respect having a community where it is a subject that is easily discussed, and not easily, but willingly discussed, let's say, especially in the Star Trek community, I have to say. And when he speaks about ethnocentrism, for me, it really rings personally, because being biracial, I face this ethnocentrism from each side of my origins. I'm or too white, or too black, or too French, or not enough. And it is something that I don't think we can really make disappear, but calling it out is a first very important step.
For me, I mean, obviously I'm white, so that's like the perspective that I'm coming into this conversation that I have. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But the thing that I reacted to in his his statement there was this sort of call to recognizing that it all sort of has the same root, whether it goes after people who are Asian Americans or Black or, you know, any other background or ethnicity. And something that I currently have been spending like the past couple of years like learning as a white trans person is like I deal with a lot of transphobia in a lot of my like the work that I do and just being out in the world, especially today with a lot of like transphobia getting intensified in a lot of spaces. And one of the things that I was learning of going through the history of where transphobia comes from is if we go back even further to even before America, like a lot of what our racial ideas come from today or come out of colonialization's attempt to sort of play Black people and especially like even Black women is like they can do the work, they can work hard, and they're not really human, they're beasts who can do these things, really horrible stuff. And so that's where like a lot of the sort of our current racial ideas come from, even though in-group out-group mentality is always exists throughout history in different ways. Our current way comes from that, and part of that way that colonialization was trying to sort of frame people of color as like people who can like are like less than human was to sort of frame white European women as like fragile and weak and needing protection against like people of color, especially like women who Black women, different women of color, as like, oh, they're not really women. And so bringing that into today, one of the things that I've learned is that as a trans woman, you know, when I experience transphobia, a lot of the sort of hate that I get as a woman and as a trans person often stems from like all the way back to colonialization's attempts to sort of frame white women as weaker, needing protection. You hear that same sort of like rhetoric against trans women, like, oh, trans women are ugly and they're trying to invade women's spaces and the same sort of thing. And it's the same sort of, it all comes out of that sort of racial aspect. And so the thing that I sort of wrestle with is like, while I face a lot of this stigmatization as a trans person, I, as a white person and as a white trans person, I am not the primary target of this transphobia. I get affected by it, but like the primary target are people of color. And it's like, and so that's why you often see like Black trans women of color and Black trans women and Black trans women and trans women of color often being the most in danger of being harmed. So it's just something that I sort of like recognize and try to think about in my activism to just sort of be intersectional and think intersectionally in that way, where it's like, I need to talk about issues that affect trans people, but also being aware that I am not the primary target as a white person in a lot of these discourses and rhetorics. So that's something that just struck me in George Takei's statement.
Yeah, definitely. So taking all of that in mind and trying to bring it back to Star Trek, because we are talking about Star Trek too, are there moments within any of the series, any storylines or episodes or anything that really stand out to you that maybe have affected your outlook on everything that all three of you just said?
There are many.
Where do you start?
Yeah, I think when you asked me the question a few days earlier, the first thing that came to my mind, it's that moment in Balance of Terror where everybody looks at Spock because he looks like the enemy, like the Romulan on the screen. And there's this bridge officer that start reacting and being, racist towards Spock, who is the first officer on the bridge, right? And there's this moment where Kirk says, "There's no bigotry on my bridge," and sends him to his quarters. And for me, it's maybe something very small, but that's again this calling out that very often when I'm in a room and I hear something racist or directed to me, or my first reaction is always to be, is it me? Am I making this up? And having somebody saying, "Nuh-uh, this is not something I want to hear. This is not a space. This is not what we're doing right here," is very important. And seeing the captain saying that at that moment on this episode is always a very important moment for me in Star Trek. And it's a small thing because Star Trek addressed the question of racism poorly, questionably, very often in many different series. But this one is always the first one that comes to my mind because it comes from the captain. And I wish that in my life, people in power in the room would be more like Kirk in this moment. And he doesn't berate him. He doesn't send him. He doesn't like fire him. He sends him away and tell him this is not the space. And I think it's a very important moment for me in Star Trek.
Are there, you mentioned poorly. You can always, if anybody has some examples of poorly as well, you can include that.
I was gonna mention two episodes. One that did it poorly, but was also often highlighted, and then one that I think, for me at least, did it well. One that I think like is interesting to talk about is Let This Be Your Final Battlefield, Last Battlefield.
Yeah, Last Battlefield.
Last Battlefield in season 3, which you know, a lot of people point to as like, look at Star Trek trying to tackle you know, issues of its time. And I think that at the time that episode was made, it was sort of seen as this really progressive episode, as it was like tackling, you know, using alien metaphor to sort of tackle you know, these, like, how silly racism is just on a base level. It's like, oh, one person's half black, half white sort of thing on one side, and who it's ultimately doesn't matter. And it sort of gets at that in an interesting way. But the problem with the episode is it, to a degree, kind of equivocates both sides, saying like, oh, they're both equally ridiculous, you know, as opposed, and there's some nuance to it, but there is that sort of like a little bit of equivocation of like how they're both sort of like equally ridiculous to a degree. And so obviously that is not how we understand racism and the institutional racism today, about like how there's institutions, how it's not just individual, how it's also not just like, you know, white people are just as bad as people of color. You know, it's like, no, there are white people, and the white supremacist racist institutions that we have in our country today are very much the ones to blame. And so there's that aspect of like looking at Star Trek through that lens of like how things were thought of at the time and how we progressed in terms of thinking about it, which is what I always love to use Star Trek for. It's such a great touch piece for how we thought about individual issues during the time in which each show was made, and both the problems and the correct ways that it gets discussed. And then one that I always like think, I mean, Deep Space Nine just in general, I think handles racial issues generally pretty well as a series. But one that I'd always like punches me in the gut is Far Beyond the Stars, which is the one where Sisko gets sort of teleported into the body of Benny Russell in some sci-fi vague nonsense stuff. But it was sort of like looking at what if a black man had come up with the idea for Deep Space Nine specifically, but just generally like Star Trek, and how his, like, Gene Rodenberry gets to make this idea that gets venerated as like this progressive, beautiful ideal. And we sort of hold it up. But if a black man had made it around that time, or slightly before, like, it would be devalued, forgotten, tossed aside. He would have to face tons and tons of individual and institutional racism, it just sort of like take that idea away from him or downplay that idea. And despite how inspiring and wonderful it was, and Avery Brooks's performance and directing in that episode is absolutely astounding and heartbreaking. To the point where you'd hear the story about how, like, he went during that one scene where he breaks down at the end, near the end of that episode, that Avery Brooks like literally
I get chills
kept crying.
just thinking about that. Yeah.
So just those two episodes, I think in particular, interesting ones to point out.
Excellent. Giraffe, on this list, you have a Twilight Zone episode.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
Always going off script. It's about Star Trek. Let's talk about the Twilight Zone. So it's very interesting because the Twilight Zone and Star Trek are contemporary, right, on TV at that time. And Rod Serling was a pretty famous writer already, TV writer at that time, and when Emmett Till was murdered, and he really wanted to confront the audiences with their biases and racism, and he started writing about segregation and racism and lynching, and the TV censors wrote him off. And he could not put on TV what he wanted to write. So he came up with the Twilight Zone. That was a way to use metaphor to put the audience again and again in a position of discomfort. And there's this episode called The Encounter, which is in the last season, I think, of Twilight Zone. Somebody's going to fact check me, but I don't remember. Where George Takei play these Japanese American man that comes to help a guy who wants somebody to lawn his lawn or or something like this, and he ends up being locked in this attic with that man who is a veteran like him. And there is this Japanese saber with them, and there is this whole moment where they go through their guilt, their hatred, their biases, and it's such a tense episode that really puts out in the open everything that happened during the war, post-war. And every time I watch it, I'm always thinking what it was for George Takei, who went in internment camp and saw all this in his life as a person to play this character. It's an incredible episode that I encourage everybody to watch, because first of all, the performance of the actors is incredible. But it really makes you think too of the moment where these episodes were written, and the society that was watching these episodes at that time, plus the actors and their own personal history with racism and biases and guilt from the war and PTSD. So yeah, it's an incredible episode, a must watch, that I think tackles racism way more upfront than Star Trek would ever do, to be honest.
I have it added on my list because I have not seen it, and I feel bad that I haven't seen that because it sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to move on to our next clip. Let's take a look at that.
Trek said in the 1960s, your sexuality was a well-protected secret, I guess is the word we'll use. Today, we've got Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz, who play a gay couple on the show, and they are both openly gay actors. We've got Blue Del Barrio and Ian Alexander, who are trans and non-binary, and we're in a relationship on this show. Discovery showrunner Michelle Paradise is openly gay, and Strange New Worlds had trans actress Jessie James Keitel on as a guest star. So I'm just wondering, how pleased are you that you've lived to see this kind of inclusion? And be honest, how often do you get even a twinge of jealousy that they're experiencing that this way now in a way that you didn't get to?
Not jealousy, because I wouldn't be competing for the same roles. I recognize the passage of time. I lived in my time, and they're living in their time. And in some small way, I contributed to their being able to live in their time, which is what we are enjoying today. It was survival. I passionately loved acting, and I wanted an acting career. And I knew I could not have it if it were known that I was gay. So as a survival thing, I was closeted. And believe me, I would much rather not have been, because it was torturous. I'm an activist. I was active in the civil rights movement, African Americans campaigning for equality. I was active in the peace movement during the Vietnam War. And by that time, I had a thriving career. And so I joined a Hollywood peace movement called the Entertainment Industry for Peace and Justice, EIPJ, where I worked together with people like Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland, and particularly with Jane. And so I was involved in all these other social issues, but the one issue that was closest to me, most personal to me, I had to keep hidden. And believe me, that was not easy. In fact, it was painful, because there were people that gave everything up, their jobs, their careers. Some lost their families, and they were campaigning for my equality. And to remain quiet during all that was torturous. Most of my adult life was spent in the closet, a very painful experience.
where to go from here on that. I guess the big question is what impacts, because George Takei in that clip talks about, all of the activism that he worked in other ways, but probably actually, I guess, since his coming out and what led to his coming out and everything since, and also Star Trek in general, what impacts have you seen after that from George? Because he was so upset, it seems like, throughout his life that he had to remain quiet. But I guess it was 2005 that he finally came out. So what have we seen from him since then, though?
He's an icon of that community. Like, for Star Trek in particular, he's already an icon, but like he is a gay person out in the world, and he's like a pole for people to look to. I think that, as painful as that sounds, and I can't relate, white hetero dude, to be in the closet for that many years, like to come out the other side of that and to be so publicly open. I mean, it has to be like a veneration or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, for me, like a similar experience, like, I'm lucky enough to be, as he was saying, like living in the time that I live in, where it's easier in some ways, harder in others, but easier to come out as trans now and as LGBTQ. And it's just an interesting thing for me where it was like, I hid this thing about myself for so long that, is now like one of the first things that people know about me, either through my public persona or sometimes just even before I was more passing as I am now. I just see me, or like sometimes I'll like be wearing very flamboyant sort of stuff or whatever. So it's just an interesting to this thing that I hid so much is now like a very prominent part of my my voice and my activism and who I am as just a person. And so that's sort of an interesting sort of push and pull between like who I was and who I am and that sort of journey in my life. To think about it, George Takei specifically, in that it's so wonderful to see him come out now and like talk about these things about what were happening back then, to sort of have that history. I mean, it sucks so much that he went through that. But it also allows us to, just as fans looking at Star Trek, to recognize, and again, this is why I love Star Trek, because it allows us to talk about these issues at the time that they were made, is that like people often like try to erase the history of LGBTQ people before the present day, saying it's like a modern fad or a modern thing, people coming out. It's like, no, gay people were always here fighting these fights, like to the point, like he didn't say it in that clip, but I've heard interviews with Takei where he said like he went up to Gene Rodenberry as like a concerned liberal party, not for myself, but he would like go up to Gene Rodenberry and be like, hey, we should tackle the quote gay issue, and sort of hiding the fact that he was gay, but trying to like push that forward. And at the time, Gene Rodenberry didn't think that it was something he could fight for, because he's like, oh, I'm fighting for racial issues on the show, so I can't fight that fight. And it's sort of that problem of like sometimes there's an understandable argument to be made there, but also sort of like not recognizing that these are interconnected fights. Sometimes when you have allies who don't realize that these things should be fought for. And that brings us into like things like Star Trek of the 80s and 90s, which is what I grew up on, and how you can see sort of this twofold thing that happened there. Whereas like, because of the fact that this was science fiction, I could have my representation in the form of alien metaphor, of like characters like Jadzia Dax, who means so much to me. And I got to see myself as a trans person through her. And that means so much to me. But then also recognizing some of the problems that were going on behind the scenes at the same time, where you had people like, Ira Stephen Bear sort of talking about in the documentary, he was the showrunner of Deep Space Nine, where he's like, we knew Garak as a character was gay, but we never fought for it because we didn't think we would get it approved. It's like, oh, so it wasn't something that interested you. It wasn't something that was core to who you were. And so it's not something that you put up front as something to fight for. And I understand the failing of like that problem, but it's sort of like, you should have fought for this too. And then also it speaks to the culture that was there behind the scenes of Star Trek, with people like, we've heard talks about like Rick Berman, for example, being someone who actively pushed down a lot of LGBTQ content in the series. Despite like Gene Roddenberry towards the end of his life saying that he wanted to have LGBTQ representation in Star Trek. And then getting to today, where we do have this plethora of representation, because it's the culture shift and the people behind the scenes shifting as well, like Michelle Paradise and Star Trek Discovery. So to just bring it back to George really quickly to wrap up my thoughts, is just like, it is so wonderful to see him be able to live the way he can now and be so active and vocal about it and be such a great advocate, because he's an inspiration to me. And also the fact that him being able to be out now allows us to look back at this long history of Star Trek and say that like, even though you didn't see LGBTQ people explicitly on the screen, we were always there fighting these fights in some way, shape, or form, both with ourselves, both institutionally, and with our allies and enemies as well. At the same time, enemies being probably the wrong word to use, but you sort of get the idea. So.
It's like holding a mirror up to society as that, going through that as well. Like, that's a perfect way of you know, what we saw and how much we saw in Star Trek being very reflective of the whole world. So
and it's important to note that Discovery gets a lot of backlash from a certain part of the fandom. So I think we still need to recognize that a large part of the viewership is not accepting of LGBTQ characters, trans characters, non-binary characters. Even a Black female captain is not always very well accepted inside the Star Trek fandom. I mean, I wept, and I weep every time that I watch the last episode of the season 3. Oh, spoilers! Discovery, when Michael Burnham sits on the captain chair. But this is one of the shows right now on TV that is the most, that provoked the most reaction in the fandom. So Star Trek keeps pushing the boundaries.
It's one of those things that I spoke about this in one of my videos, where it's like a lot of what you see in fandom, and not just in Star Trek, but you see it in so many TV shows. We saw it recently with like the Lord of the Rings show, where it was like Star Wars, like even House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, like any big sci-fi franchise property or any TV show really. But people will sort of like complain like, oh, look, there's black dwarves in this thing, and they come up with some pseudo scientific. It's like, it's a fantasy world.
You know, black mermaid.
Exactly. People shouldn't have to fight. People shouldn't have to justify them being included in our fictions, in our stories, in our worlds. And you often see, you know, it's funny because I like modern Star Trek quite a lot, but I would even argue that I think it's sometimes even less political than older Trek. And yet you'll see a lot of people ranting about like, it's woke and it's putting politics and everything. And I'm like, which is hilarious. And if you look at what they're actually saying, a lot of the time it's just the fact that like a black person was in a thing or a LGBTQ person was in a thing. And that's what they see as the political content. And it's like, no, that just should be taken as course, but it speaks to like how much of our, because of the issues of the past, of like things like original Star Trek and older shows, where it's just that sort of straight male gaze of the work sort of normalized, like, oh, this is for a straight heterosexual consumption, and so we're going to make all these characters be mostly straight white dudes. It sort of allows people to like see that when we have actual like more reflective representation on screen of what people actually are in the real world, and I say more reflective and not even one for one, because I would say even TV shows need to be even more diverse than they are now to be really reflective of society. That like people will push back against that, saying it's woke, when actually it's because they see it that way because they haven't had to confront that within themselves for so long.
You know, that those kinds of fans, those fans that within Star Trek, they're having a problem with these things. It's like, how do you tell me that you've never watched Star Trek without saying that you've never watched Star Trek? Because it's built into the formula, man. And on top of that, you're correct in that, especially the further back you go in the Star Trek paradigm, in that it is a nominally white space, white male hetero space. The scaffolding of it is all there, and the more people of different backgrounds you put in there, it becomes harder and harder to maintain that white spaceness of it. And like, I'm having conversations with people about that, and they're not understanding it. And I'm like, I think that's going to be a big thing that's going to happen the next couple of years, and I'm hoping that Discovery really starts to play with that in some way, man. But like, if you're mad that there's a black guy on Star Trek or something, like, you're not paying attention. That was the.
But it's never like, oh, I'm mad because she's black. It's always, oh, I'm mad because she cries too much, or I'm mad because she has a boyfriend, and it's always like deflecting. And it's where we come back to the first clip. Call it out, call it what it is. You are not accepting my presence in your space, but I am here and I'm here to stay. And the other thing too that I hear people say a lot about Star Trek is like, it's the future. There are none of these issues in the future. Why should I discuss these topics in something that takes place in the future? It takes place in the future, yes, but it is a show for us nowadays on TV today. And it's important that Star Trek keeps pointing and showing and, I don't know, putting really in people's face all the representation of the world out there. Like,
I speaking on that point too about it reflecting today, like number one, there was a bunch of people who like complain about Star Trek Discovery being woke because it had like that one scene where Adira, the non-binary character, like announced their pronouns. And so there was that like very disingenuous, sort of argument. But then I also saw on the other side, and this way I understand to a degree, people being like, well, that did feel a little bit like it failed in Star Trek's sort of ethos of like, well, in the future, why would anyone need to announce their pronouns? That we should just be taking as course, like people can choose and understand their gender or articulate the gender as they grow older, which I think is absolutely correct. I think like if hopefully in the future we get to a place where we understand that gender is something that we can sort of like come to understand about ourselves as we grow, instead of having it assigned to us right when we're born, and just be able to articulate to the people around us as we come to understand ourselves more. So I understand, like, to some people being critical of that scene, thinking that it was a little bit on the nose and maybe sort of like not as progressive as it could have been. But Star Trek, as I've always said, is to me like the show that's like gateway for so many people and allow people to see these issues. And I've heard stories of so many non-binary people and trans people were watching Star Trek Discovery with their families, saw that scene, and were like, oh, this is a way to model that with my family, of parents getting to see Anthony Rapp play Paul Stamets' character, of just being like listening and kind of having that proud moment of just like, okay, yeah, I take that. And also a non-binary younger person being like, this is how I feel. And like kind of it being messy and weird and awkward. But that's okay. And so it's like, yeah, there are many great science fiction books that sort of like take gender as sort of like as a, a thing that we can discuss. But like, I love Star Trek sort of being in this thing that like kind of is a little bit of a messy franchise, in that like it kind of like lets us articulate these things in a way that speaks to today.
Prodigy with the character of Zero that explains what that they're non-binary, and it's so well done. And so I don't know, Prodigy is, I think, one of the best Star Trek right now out there. It's gorgeous, and the way they bring all these questions, all these characters, all these plot lines to kids and to us, because it's for adults too, is absolutely incredible.
Yeah. About that clip in particular, though, George Takei, it's very generous of him, to not feel jealous, like to understand where he is in the universe and what he's seen and what's changed. And he seems like a very generous man.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to move on to our third clip. And I feel like I need to dedicate this to Giraffe specifically because of all of the artwork that you have on your wall behind you. So let's take a look.
It was a convention at the Charleston, West Virginia. And we were flying into Pittsburgh and then connecting from Pittsburgh to Charleston. And there was an enormous storm happening. We thought we would die. The plane was dropping and going, working its way up. It took forever for us to be able to land in Pittsburgh. And by the time we landed, our connecting flight had taken off, and it was a sheer chaos. All the planes coming into Pittsburgh had the same problem. And so they said the next flight that they could get for us was the following morning, very early on. And so we thought, well, all right, then we're not going to camp out at the airport. We'll go to a hotel nearby. But all the hotels were booked up. And so Walter and I were making phones. Jimmy was with us as well. We made phone calls all over the place. And the only place that we could get that had vacancies was like about 15, 20 miles away. But we thought that's the only way we can, if that's the only way we can get a room, that'll have to be. And we got in a cab and arrived there in the late night hour. And then we tried to check in, and they said, well, we do have 2 vacancies, and they're each doubles, and so one of you will have to double up. It was 3 guys and 1 gal, Jimmy, Walter, and me, and Michelle. And so we decided, well, we'll draw straws. So we cut strips of paper, and we drew the straw, and the short straw was drawn by me. So I was planning on being a gentleman, and when we walked in, I said, you have a bed, I'll sleep on the couch. And she said, darling, I know who you are. Get your body on this bed.
So I have a very official question to pose to you, but also any Michelle love that you would like to give as well, you are welcome to. But my official question, or my official thought, was Michelle and George seem to have an amazing and supportive relationship. And in that friendship, from those 2 individuals, you have representation from 3 or more marginalized groups. So do you think maybe those shared experiences, whether they even talked about them or not, because whether they could talk about them or not, were perhaps the reason why they were so close?
Yes, absolutely. When I enter a room, if there's one other person of color, I feel safer. So I can imagine on that show, because like the other outsider in the show is Chekhov, but Walter Koenig is not Russian, right? So I think they had really a close relationship and a close friendship. And by the way, I didn't know that story, so I was so happy to hear.
Glad I could give you something new.
Something new, yes. But absolutely. And I think it's important. It must have been important for them to know that there was another person in the direct, show that could relate and could be an ally and could be a friend and could understand what it was to be a person of color in that time in Hollywood. So no, I do think it's really important.
Yeah, I agree. Like it's something that for me, like trying to always make like my activism intersectional, and what that means for me as someone who is part of like a bunch of intersecting identities that are both privileged and marginalized. Like as a trans person, I'm marginalized, but as a white person, I'm not. And so I have certain privileges because of that as well. And so it's something that, like, you know, as I articulated before, like sort of recognizing that I face these issues, you know, transphobia, I'm bisexual, so biphobia and also homophobia as well. But also recognizing too that I need to work to be an ally to others and try to make sure that I don't speak for others when it's not my turn, and give them the platform, and try to make sure that I lift up others' voices as best I can with my platform and with my privileges while speaking over them or for them, but also trying to work in coalition too. Like that's the biggest thing that like people who like to spread hate try to do is they try to pit different marginalized groups against each other. They'll like one of the things you saw in history, for example, was you saw white women suffragettes were often really racist because they were told like, oh, black women are holding you back, like black women trying to get the vote are holding your movement back, so like push them out of your movement so that you could get white women the right to vote. And you just saw that sort of racism steeped in the white suffragette movement to the point where white supremacists would often like fund white suffragette movements because it would sort of stoke that infighting that would ultimately benefit the system. And so it's always about like trying to be self-reflective about my own place and in my own community, and trying to make sure to like push for that coalition of working together to not let that infighting occur, but then also being reflective and introspective of myself, of where my failings are and where I can do better, and trying to hold myself and have others hold me accountable for mistakes that I make. And so I think that's just it's an important part of activism in any space, if that's the way you're trying to do to recognize those intersecting struggles.
Yeah. And to speak to how incredible Nicole is, just there is a lot of homophobia in the Black community, let's be honest. And it is not a given that the other person of color with you on the set is going to be somebody that will accept you as a person, as a gay man. And I think that story really touched me, because there's always, every time I enter a room with people I know, I brace, because I never know what's going to happen, what is going to be told to me, what is going to be said to me. And the fact that there's such an acceptance between these two actors at this moment, such a safe space, suddenly is a very beautiful story. And I'm gonna say that story over and over again.
Good. I think you should. So to kind of go along with this, I feel like that we actually see examples of this sort of relationship throughout the Trek canon. Do you have a particular favorite, or is there one that like you really think about more than others? This kind of idea of this unique friendship.
I was gonna say Jadzia and Cisco, but I'm sure Jesse would like to speak about Jadzia and Cisco more than me.
I will rant about those two. Not even just Dax and Cisco, because I'll make this quick because I could rant about them all day. I adore Dax and Cisco so much because it's just such a supportive relationship and a supportive friendship, and one that like understands that they can be playful and with each other because they see each other. Like, for example, Cisco has that term of endearment that he uses throughout the series for both Ezri and Jadzia, where he calls her old man, because he knew her back when Dax was Curzon and presented and was a man. And like I've seen a lot of people being like, well, if I'm going to put a trans reading on that character, like the character's not explicitly trans, but you can sort of read Dax as a trans character in because of that sort of like playing with gender. People sometimes take that like old man phrase as like, well, is he misgendering her? Is that like somewhat insulting? And I'm like, you could take it that way if you wanted to, but I just see it as like he because he is her friend. When he says that is not him saying that he's not, because what misgendering is, when someone misgenders you, especially if they do it intentionally, it is them saying to you that they don't see you. That they are actively choosing to, again, if they're doing it intentionally, to disrespect you and deny your identity as you have articulated it to them and asked them to respect about you. But when Cisco does it for Dax, he's not denying her identity. He is actually recognizing the completeness of their relationship in a way that Jadzia and Ezri have both like accepted that like it's okay if he says that. And if anyone else called her old man, she would probably call them out on that. But he's allowed to do it because they're of their friendship, and it's him saying, I recognize the totality of our history together and our friendship together, and this is a term of endearment. And so it's a very surface level, I think, criticism to say it's misgendering, because I think it actually just speaks to their relationship. And I just love their back and forth with each other, where they just are always supportive, but push each other. I say Dax because, everyone always forgets Ezri, but I love in season 7, there's that scene where Ezri's like, I don't know if I'm myself. She has like this baby trans energy where she's like, I don't know who I am. I'm trying to figure out what I mean now that I've like got this symbiote. I'm trying, like, she's just got like figuring out her identity as like young trans people often are as they're beginning transition. And Sisko's like, I know who you are. You're this person. You're amazing. You can do these things. There's literally the episode where he like calls her out and says, you can do this. I know you can be a good therapist. I know you can do this job. You need to believe in yourself because I believe in you. And I'm like, that's what such a good friend is. And I adore Sisko and Dax so much. So yeah.
I love that moment. Curzon, my old friend. It's
Mhm.
Jadzia now. Jadzia, my old friend.
Thing on say trans rights. Hell yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our 4th clip. Yeah, that's all I have to say about the 4th clip. Let's go.
What are your thoughts on death? Does it scare you? Are you accepting of it? And honestly, what are your thoughts on the afterlife as well?
I said it would have read, here lies Yukaru Sulu, and in the next line, in smaller letters, AKA George Takei.
Okay.
I got it all wrong. But your question was,
what are your thoughts on death? Does
my
it scare
thoughts on-
you?
No,
Or you
no,
accept?
no, not at all. I'm a Buddhist, and I have a very Buddhistic view of both life and death. We believe in the oneness with nature. And just to make that metaphor a little bit more specific, I'm today the result and the personification of all that's happened to me in my life and all that's made me who I am, the food I've eaten, the ideas I've had, the people that have inspired me has made me who I am. And when I lie face of mortal death, then I would be buried, and the roots of trees would come and become take a piece of me, and so I'll be a part of that tree. That's the afterlife, or a leaf, and a bird might pick at that leaf, and I'll be part of that bird. So right now, I'm the product of all these other forces that have brought me to this point. And in the same way, when I'm gone, I'll be contributing to the continuum in different forms and shapes. It's a metaphorical use of what the Buddhist belief of life and death is.
And what about the Buddhist feeling on the afterlife? Does the soul live on? Is there reincarnation?
Well, I'm reincarnated in that tree or that leaf or that bird. So there's a set amount of energy in this planet, and it's the constant changing of those energy pieces taking different shapes and different form. I'm a different person from that 5-year-old kid that we talked about coming out after internment. I've changed, and I'm living the afterlife of that 5-year-old boy. But when I go, I will be continuing on with the impressions that I've made in this life, the contributions that I've made in this life, and I will continue on in the new molecular, if you will, shape and forms that I've taken on.
All right. So I love that clip because I feel like when I listen to him talking about this concept of death, it's very comforting. It's very soothing to me. Like just a nice way of looking at it. And so my question is specifically coming back to Star Trek again, is there anything that you have taken from Star Trek obviously there's a lot of science that has been taken from Star Trek, but is there anything specifically you have taken from Star Trek that has really influenced your outlook on life and death?
I I think that George's perspective as a Buddhist is oddly, it tracks exactly with mine as like a science person, and I credit Star Trek with opening that door. Like it pushed me to think about science. I ended up going to school, and to this day, like exactly what he was describing just now, like is kind of how I feel about it. And I'm not even accidentally Buddhist, so like the fact that they overlap so much, I I think that's Star Trek's fault in me. I think, and you know.
It's interesting to like look at Star Trek. I mean, there's obviously in some ways there's these storytelling tropes around deaths, with like characters dying and then coming back, where you have like Spock coming back, or
Shax.
you know, yeah, Shax, and a bunch of different characters that happens, or even Dax to a degree. I mean, even looking at Dax, it kind of like goes into that idea of like memory and the impressions that you leave behind. Like a new person sort of carries on that memory. Even though like Jadzia died, Curzon died, you know, that memory is carried on specifically in Esri, but you can even just speak of metaphorically, like people's memories carry on within us. And so it's just sort of an interesting thing to look at Star Trek in that sci-fi way, because it's like, oh, this continuance of individual self sometimes happens that we have in stories like this, veneration of certain characters and certain things like that. But I also like looking at Star Trek. If you look at it as a franchise, it's interesting that it's one of the few franchises that we really get that has like a generational look at different things, where you get to see how like people like Archer then influence, you know, Kirk and Spock, who influence like Picard, who then influence like the people in Discovery's time. And I actually really kind of like that, where you get to just see that the memory of people and the impacts that people have on the world build upon each other, and that you get to see like how people's positive work in the world can actually make the world better and better and better. And yeah, there are you know, fallbacks, tipping points, and things like that. And so it's like what really resonates with me in George's statement about that is like just you know, we may die, and like the person that we are, like our memories may die, and our individual selves may die, but the impacts that we leave upon the world and the energy that we leave upon the world will have an effect. And you get to see that just in the way that Star Trek is set up through generations, and you get to see how that palimpsest of positive work just be built up.
And as I was saying at the beginning, I won't be here in 2370. None of us will, and we don't know what will our future look like. But Star Trek gives me the will and the strength to take as many steps as I can in my little span of life right now in the 21st century, to make sure that something of that utopia may be possible in the 22nd century or 23rd century. It gives me hope. It gives me a motivation that we can do better, and it starts with us. It starts, if our parents didn't do it, then it's our role to do it, and to try to take every single step as much as we can. And then we die, and it's up to the next generation and the next, no pun intended, to keep taking these steps one after another, so a future like that can be possible.
Thank you for that. Okay, so it's been an amazing but very heavy discussion, but I appreciate it. I think it's been a learning experience. But I'd love to show a lighter clip to kind of wrap us up here. So bring the mood up even more. So let's take a look.
Love ice cream.
Ooh, what flavor?
All the different flavors. I love chocolate, but it's got to be deep, dark, bittersweet chocolate. But they come up with all these wonderful concoctions nowadays. Rocky Road with all the mix of nuts and
Marshmallows.
you get marshmallows. So the contrast of the soft and crunchy and the chocolatey taste. But it's my favorite is clean, pure, deep, dark chocolate.
My question to you is, what is your guilty pleasure? And do you even feel guilty about it?
That's a hard one.
You want to know mine? I'll tell you mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Cheese. And no, I do not feel guilty about it.
I'm French. Cheese is just part of like the food base. It's how it is. It's like
its own category.
its own food group.
Mhm.
It is not guilty. It's just necessary.
My guilty pleasure, like it just food wise, would be sushi. Like I will splurge on sushi. You know, mostly like I'm here for the frozen dinner food because I work so much. But like I'll splurge on sushi. And then in terms of like guilty pleasure, like things that I enjoy, like kind of like older, like weird video games I like to play. So like they're like mediocre or bad, like Sonic the Hedgehog video games that I love to play that everyone like hates and like, oh, these are trash. I'm like, I love them. They're fun. They bring me joy. So yeah, we got it. That's my guilty pleasure.
Nice.
I'm with George. Ice cream is
Ice
it.
cream.
It's the
Ice cream
ultimate.
is life.
Ice cream and then maybe pecan pie.
Oh,
Ooh, okay, Trip Talker.
In particular, right now, like the Publix supermarket chain is selling something called Swamp Monster, and it is delicious. It's got like
What is-
raspberry chocolate and peanuts in it, and it's got like fudge swirls, and it's just like, you know,
and
episode
so it's ice cream,
it's ice cream. Yeah.
and
There-
it's Publix brand ice cream.
Yes, it's their like premium brand or whatever. It's like $4 for a little pint.
Oh,
It's pink.
There is there's a place near where I live that is an ice cream shop just down the road that during a specific time of year they sell, I think it's like blackberry goat cheese ice cream.
Oh my god, that sounds
And
delicious.
it's so good. It's so good.
I have just to say about the pecan pie that I had no idea what a pecan pie was when I was watching Enterprise, because it's not something that is really findable in Europe. So when I came to America and I found pecan pie, I was like, like in Enterprise. And I really like pecan pie. I don't think I have pleasure that is guilty. I really enjoy things that give me pleasure.
Sure.
Really, it's a big part of my life. I take cosplay though, because I spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of sanity, all that to wear a costume for 8 hours straight and not feel my toes anymore for a full week.
To the point where you got to be an actual freaking Romulan by the actual Star Trek makeup person at Star
Yes.
Trek Day this year, which
And
is
it was
amazing.
a huge, like, I don't know, it's just, it gives me so much fun, so much, and what makes me vibrate with passion, you know. But it's just guilty because I should be doing a lot of things I'm not doing when I'm sewing stuff.
No, it's not guilty. I added the "do you even feel guilty" part because when people ask people what's your guilty pleasure, it's like, yeah, not really, don't really feel guilty about it, you know. All right, well, thank you everybody out there who is still here and commenting, for being here. If you are new to the companion, here's your chance to stay longer and see what we're all about. You can start your 30-day trial at thecompanion.app/Star Trek and see all the other To Boldly Ask interviews, both ready to watch and upcoming while you're there. And as I said earlier, I'm a producer here, but before I even had any kind of inkling about being a producer, I was a member, and I still am. So some recent highlights in my member's mind, aside from George Takei, obviously, have to be Stargate AI, where scenes created by a super sophisticated AI are read in a table read style by cast members of both SG-1 and Atlantis. There's also the Frank Spotnitz storytelling masterclass that happened just last weekend. And people were able to get so much information for their own writing processes or even life organizing processes. I also recently read our article, Jesse making me think about this article a lot. There's a recent one called Trill is Trans, which used the trill in Star Trek to put into context the evolving attitudes towards gender variance. And the nice thing about that article is it talks about things that didn't work too, did and didn't within Star Trek. But the first event that really pulled me into the companion and kept me here was Amanda Tapping uplifting women in film and television. And it was the idea of a place that was willing to not only bring in my favorite actors and my favorite shows, but to have important and necessary conversations with them and to speak with them in a way that made me feel really connected to them. So take a look around. To Boldly Ask is an ongoing series. There are interviews with Jonathan Frakes, John Delancey, and George Takei available to watch right now. Next week, we will be chatting with Robert Picardo, followed by Marina Sirtis the following week, and we have a lot more planned down the road as far as Star Trek is concerned. I would like to thank my guests, Jesse Gender, Kyle Sullivan, aka Trexpertise, and Spotted Giraffe for chatting with me today. I can genuinely personally say that I have grown from this experience, so I thank you for all of your perspectives and all of your words. If you don't follow these folks on YouTube and socials, you definitely should. All of their links are in the description of this live. So there's some Patreon links as well as YouTube links. And yeah, so thank you all out there. And thank you all here for being here for this very important, I think, necessary conversation. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.
All right. And I hope to see everyone around the companion. So take a look, click the link, take a look at what we have to offer for you, and have a wonderful evening.